Tea was a quiet evening when the police received the first unsettling phone call. A family of 4 had vanished without a trace. No sign of struggle, no ransom note, just an empty house and a growing fear that something much darker had unfolded behind closed doors. It started like any other missing person case. The Johnson family, Father Richard, Mother Claire, and their 2 children, 15-year-old Amy and 10-year-old Ben, had simply vanished. Their neighbors hadn't seen them for days. The mail piled up in the mailbox. No phone calls, no emails, no messages. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Detective Megan Hayes was called to the scene in a quiet suburban neighborhood. At first, the case seemed simple enough. Perhaps the family had gone on a trip without notifying anyone. Maybe they were avoiding their debts or simply needed to start fresh somewhere else. But something didn't sit right with Megan. The house was too clean, too orderly for a family that had abruptly packed up and left. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no possessions missing. The most eerie thing was that the family's car was still parked in the driveway, the engine cold. With no clues to follow, the case quickly spiraled into one of the most baffling mysteries of the year. Was this an elaborate ruse? Or had something sinister happened to the family? The community was left to wonder, and the case went cold for years. The investigation stalls. Over the next few months, Detective Hayes and her team tried everything they could to solve the case. They interviewed neighbors, checked local surveillance footage, and looked into the family's history. But all their efforts turned up nothing. Richard had been a quiet man, no known enemies, and Claire had been a dedicated mother. Amy and Ben were good kids, nothing unusual in their behavior or school records. There were no signs of financial strain or personal issues. It was as though the family had simply evaporated. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local handyman, Greg, came forward after he'd been keeping a secret for years. "I had been doing some work for the Johnsons," Greg confessed to the police, wringing his hands in nervousness. "About a year before they vanished, Richard asked me to help him install something in the basement. Something strange." Detective Hayes leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean by something strange?" Greg swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. "Richard asked me to help him build a secret room, one with a hidden door. He said it was for storage, but it was odd. It didn't seem right. The room had no windows, and it was locked from the inside. He told me not to tell anyone about it. The secret room." The revelation of the secret room stirred something inside Megan. Could it be that Richard had been hiding something, or someone, down there? Was the family's disappearance connected to whatever was locked behind that hidden door? Megan immediately ordered a search of the Johnson family's home. The house was still untouched, a frozen moment in time. She instructed the officers to head straight for the basement, where the secret room was believed to be located. As they searched, they found nothing unusual at first, just the typical clutter of an old basement. But then, after hours of investigation, they discovered the hidden panel in the far corner. It was well concealed behind a stack of old boxes, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't actively looking for it. The officers carefully pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into a dark, damp room. As they descended into the room, they couldn't believe what they found. Inside the secret space, hidden from the world, was a family, alive but unrecognizable from their years of confinement. The Johnson family had been trapped in this secret room for 9 long years. The revelation. Richard, Claire, Amy, and Ben were all there, huddled together in a dark corner of the room. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies frail, and their clothes ragged. But their most haunting feature was their eyes, haunted, fearful, and full of the desperation of years spent in isolation. Megan's heart sank as she approached the family, trying to make sense of the horror they had endured. The room was small, with no windows, just a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was no furniture, just a few blankets scattered on the floor. The air was thick and musty, and the smell of mildew and decay filled the room. Richard, now a shadow of the man he once was the first to speak. We're alive," he muttered weakly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "We didn't think anyone would find us." Claire, her face lined with age and fear, reached out for her children, her eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "We never thought we'd see the outside again. We never thought we'd escape." The questions came flooding in. How had they survived? Why hadn't they tried to escape? What had happened all those years ago? But the answers were slow to come. Richard and Claire were in shock, unable to explain what had transpired in those 9 years. All they knew was that someone had put them there, and for reasons they still couldn't fully understand, they had been trapped in that room for far too long. The family was taken to the hospital immediately. Doctors worked tirelessly to assess their health, but the damage was evident. The physical toll of being confined for so long had left its mark on them. They were malnourished, dehydrated, and emotionally broken. The return of the truth. As the days went by, the family slowly began to open up, revealing more details about their captivity. They explained that Richard had been the one who initially constructed the room with the help of the mysterious stranger who had coerced them into hiding. Claire spoke of how she had been threatened by an unknown man, who had made it clear that any attempt to escape or seek help would lead to the death of her children. The stranger had appeared at their door one evening, claiming to be a relative with dangerous enemies. He had convinced Richard that the family was in grave danger, that their lives were at risk if they stayed in their own home. The man had promised protection but only under one condition: they would need to disappear, completely, for their own safety. Terrified for her children, Claire had agreed. The family was locked inside the room, and for years, they had been held captive under the guise of safety. The stranger had delivered food and supplies occasionally, but over time, his visits became less frequent. Eventually, they had been abandoned, left to survive on their own in the darkness. It was a chilling reminder of how easily trust could be manipulated and lives shattered by fear. The Johnsons had spent 9 years in captivity, believing they were safe, when in reality, they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. As the family slowly began to heal and adjust to life in the outside world, their story became a sensation, drawing both sympathy and horror from the public. People were captivated by their survival, their resilience, and their courage in the face of such unimaginable suffering. But the story also raised troubling questions about the person, or people, who had orchestrated their captivity. And as the investigation into the mysterious stranger continued, Megan knew that this case was far from over. The truth, she realized, was only beginning to unravel. After 9 years of captivity, the Johnson family was finally free. But as the truth began to unravel, Detective Hayes discovered that their nightmare wasn't just the result of one man's twisted plot. It was part of a much darker conspiracy. The real danger had only just begun. The aftermath of rescue. The public was mesmerized by the dramatic rescue of the Johnson family. News outlets reported on their miraculous survival in hushed tones, with a mixture of awe and disbelief. How could a family of 4 be locked away in a hidden room for nearly a decade without anyone noticing? The world wanted answers, and Detective Megan Hayes was determined to uncover the full truth behind their confinement. As the Johnsons slowly regained their strength in the hospital, Megan began digging deeper into the mystery. She wasn't satisfied with the family's initial account. There were too many unanswered questions. How had Richard, someone who had never been involved in any criminal activity, been drawn into building a secret room, and why had Claire never attempted to escape during those 9 years? The more she questioned them, the more unsettling the answers became. Richard, still recovering from his ordeal, seemed almost incapable of articulating his thoughts. His mind was fractured from years of isolation. It was clear that he was suffering from some form of trauma, but Megan suspected there was more to his story. Claire, on the other hand, was still haunted by the memory of the man who had abducted them. His face was burned into her memory, but she couldn't recall his name or any details about his life. As Megan dug into their past, she discovered something that would change everything. Claire's father, a well-known architect in the city, had been involved in a string of shady dealings years before the family's disappearance. He had connections to organized crime, money laundering, and black market dealings, activities he had tried to cover up when he realized the extent of his involvement. Megan learned that Claire's family had been estranged for years, and it appeared that her father had tried to sever all ties with them to protect them from his dangerous associates. The mysterious stranger. The more Megan learned about Claire's past, the more questions she had about the mysterious stranger who had held the family captive. The man had claimed to be a relative with dangerous enemies, and his involvement seemed central to the Johnsons' captivity. But who was he, and why had he been so insistent that the family go into hiding? Claire described the stranger as a man in his early 40s, tall, with a cold, calculated demeanor. He was well dressed and always seemed to have money to burn. She recalled that he had appeared suddenly, with no warning, and started talking about threats from an unnamed enemy. He promised them safety, claiming that he knew people who could protect them. But Megan knew something didn't add up. After several interviews with Claire and Richard, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The man had been too familiar with their lives. He knew the layout of their house, the family's routine, and even the vulnerabilities in their finances. Megan speculated that he might have been someone close to the family, a relative or an associate with intimate knowledge of their personal affairs. But there was something else, something that chilled her to the bone. The stranger had been so controlling that, at one point, he had forced Richard to help him build the hidden room. At first, Richard had been reluctant to comply, but the stranger had promised him that it would only be a temporary measure. Once the threats were neutralized, the family would be free to return to their normal lives. But the man had lied. A darker plot unfolds. Megan's investigation took a new turn when she discovered that the man who had imprisoned the Johnson family wasn't just some random criminal. He was connected to Claire's father's dark dealings. The stranger was one of the many enforcers working for a larger crime syndicate, one that had been operating in the shadows for years. And what was most shocking of all was the discovery that the family's disappearance had been orchestrated not just for their safety, but for something far more sinister: money. Claire's father had been laundering money through a series of legitimate businesses, but his criminal ties had grown too entangled with organized crime. It appeared that the syndicate had become aware of Claire's father's betrayal and was using the family as leverage to ensure his silence. Richard and Claire had been forced to disappear because they had unknowingly stumbled into a web of dangerous criminals and corrupt dealings. The secret room had been part of a plan to keep the family hidden, locked away from the world, until the heat died down. The stranger had been paid to ensure their isolation, and over the years, the criminals had simply forgotten about them. As Claire's father's influence waned, so did the attention from the syndicate. But they had left the Johnsons to rot in that room, with no one the wiser. The truth behind the trap. With this new information in hand, Detective Hayes tracked down several former associates of Claire's father, piecing together a complex puzzle. One by one, she interviewed members of the crime syndicate, using carefully gathered evidence to expose the dark network that had manipulated the Johnsons. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The stranger who had forced the family into hiding was, in fact, a pawn in a much larger game of betrayal, corruption, and violence. Megan soon learned that the stranger was someone who had been watching the Johnson family for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had posed as a protector, a family member, in order to gain their trust. And it was through this manipulation that the Johnsons had fallen into the trap. Claire's father had been aware of the growing danger, but he had failed to warn his daughter. He had failed to protect his own family. As the investigation into the syndicate grew more complicated, Megan began to feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had uncovered a dangerous network of criminals operating in plain sight, but this discovery came at a cost. The closer she got to the heart of the conspiracy, the more dangerous it became. The syndicate was not about to let anyone expose their operations, and Detective Hayes soon found herself a target. But even with threats looming, Megan pressed forward. The truth had to come out, for the sake of the Johnsons and the countless other families whose lives had been destroyed by the web of crime that had ensnared them. Megan's determination to bring the perpetrators to justice would not be swayed, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. A family reclaimed, a mystery unsolved. The Johnson family's recovery was far from complete. They still struggled with trauma, haunted by the years of isolation, the years of being forgotten. But with Megan's help, they began to rebuild their lives. The community rallied around them, offering support and understanding as they tried to heal from the horrors they had endured. Though the truth had come to light, the ultimate fate of the criminals responsible for their captivity remained uncertain. The syndicate had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, and many members were still at large. Detective Hayes knew that the investigation wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still loose ends to tie up, still people to find, and still justice to be served. As for the Johnsons, they had found a new sense of freedom, one that would take time to fully embrace. The road to recovery would be long, but with the support of those who cared for them, they had a chance at reclaiming the life they had once lost. And for Detective Megan Hayes, the case had become more than just a mystery to solve. It was a fight for justice, a fight against a system that had allowed innocent lives to be destroyed in the shadows. As the investigation into the Johnson family's captivity deepens, Detective Megan Hayes uncovers a dangerous conspiracy that threatens to destroy everything she's worked for. With the syndicate growing more desperate and violent, Megan must race against time to expose the truth before more lives are lost. A break in the case. Detective Megan Hayes knew that she was getting closer to something big. The more she unraveled about the syndicate that had orchestrated the Johnson family's imprisonment, the clearer it became that they were no ordinary criminals. They were highly organized, ruthless, and had deep ties to the upper echelons of society. With each new piece of information, Megan felt a greater weight on her shoulders. She wasn't just chasing down a group of criminals, she was staring down a powerful and dangerous network that could reach further than anyone realized. Her breakthrough came one night when she received a call from an old informant. Marcus "Slick" Howard, a former member of the syndicate, had agreed to meet her. Megan had worked with him in the past, but she never fully trusted him. He was known for playing both sides of the law and had a reputation for double-dealing. But she was desperate for answers, and Marcus had always been one to know things others didn't. They met in a dingy alley, far from prying eyes. As Megan stepped out of her car, she could feel the tension in the air. The city seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Marcus was waiting, his usual bravado replaced by a look of genuine concern. "You're digging too deep, Hayes," he warned, glancing around nervously. "You don't know what you're getting into." Megan's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly what I'm getting into." The Johnson family didn't just disappear, they were stolen. And the people responsible for that have far more to lose than anyone realizes. Marcus hesitated, then glanced around again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not wrong. This goes deeper than just one family. The syndicate has its claws in places you wouldn't believe. But you need to know something. Someone inside the police department is involved. Someone high up. I don't know who yet, but it's bad. Real bad." Megan felt a chill run down her spine. A mole inside the force. The thought was enough to make her stomach twist in knots. But she couldn't afford to back down. "Not now. Tell me everything you know," she urged, her voice steady despite the rising fear in her chest. Marcus sighed and began to explain. He told her about a hidden account that the syndicate used to launder money through legitimate businesses, and how Claire's father had once been a crucial player in that scheme. But the deeper he went, the more disturbing the details became. It seemed that the Johnson family's disappearance wasn't just an accident. It had been orchestrated with the intention of keeping them quiet about the syndicate's operations. The dangerous game of cat and mouse. With Marcus's information in hand, Megan continued to dig deeper. She followed the money trail and uncovered a series of transactions that led her to several prominent business figures, some of whom were involved in high-profile legal cases. The more she investigated, the clearer it became that the syndicate had infiltrated various sectors of society, from real estate to politics to law enforcement. No one was safe. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous her investigation became. Megan started receiving threats, anonymous letters, phone calls in the dead of night, and even a near-fatal car accident that she was lucky to survive. It was clear that the syndicate was aware of her pursuit, and they weren't about to let a detective stand in their way. In one chilling encounter, Megan was nearly ambushed by a pair of masked men who followed her from her office to her car. She only managed to escape when she noticed the reflection of one of the attackers in the side mirror and swerved to avoid him. The car crashed into a nearby wall, but Megan was unharmed. That night, she realized just how far the syndicate was willing to go to protect their secrets. With every lead, Megan found herself deeper in a web of lies and deception. But she couldn't stop. The stakes were too high. The Johnsons had been victims of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond their own family's turmoil. The truth had to come out, no matter what the cost. A revelation from the past. As the threats mounted, Meghan found herself relying more on her instincts. She began to suspect that someone close to the family had been pulling the strings all along, and the answers might lie in the Johnsons' past. She took another trip to the family home, hoping to uncover something she had missed. The house, abandoned for years, still bore the marks of its former life. The furniture was dusty, the rooms dark and silent. But as Meghan sifted through the old papers in the study, something caught her eye. It was an old letter, hidden among a pile of discarded documents. The letter was addressed to Claire's father, and it was written in a code that Meghan couldn't immediately decipher. But there was something eerie about it. The handwriting was familiar, and the tone of the letter was menacing. It hinted at something much darker than money laundering. There was talk of betrayal, of trust broken, and of someone who had been working both sides of the law. Meghan took the letter to a forensic linguist, hoping to decode the message. When the translation came back, her blood ran cold. The letter was a direct threat from the syndicate to Claire's father, warning him that if he didn't comply with their demands, his family would suffer. It was clear that the syndicate had known about the Johnson family's disappearance long before they'd gone into hiding. But the most chilling part was the final line of the letter. "The trap is set. The game has already begun. The final push for justice." Armed with this new evidence, Meghan confronted the people she believed were behind the scheme. She went public with her findings, exposing the syndicate's criminal empire for the world to see. The truth was out, but it came at a steep price. The police department was thrown into chaos as the corruption within its ranks was laid bare. Many officers were implicated, and the investigation led to several arrests, including high-ranking officials who had been complicit in the syndicate's operations. Meghan's life became a constant battle, as she worked tirelessly to bring down the criminals responsible for the Johnson family's suffering. The threats continued, but so did her resolve. In the end, the Johnsons received the justice they had been denied for so long. The syndicate was dismantled, and many of its members were brought to trial. Claire and Richard, though still scarred by their experience, were finally able to rebuild their lives. Meghan's career, however, would never be the same. She had lost friends in the process, and the weight of the conspiracy would haunt her forever. But as she stood in the courtroom, watching as the criminals were sentenced, she knew one thing: the truth had prevailed. And the Johnson family had finally been freed from the nightmare that had held them captive for so long. As the trial comes to a close, Detective Meghan Hayes faces the haunting consequences of her pursuit of justice. The truth has been revealed, but the cost is far higher than anyone could have anticipated. In the end, the detective is forced to confront not only the powerful syndicate but the darker side of herself. The trial begins. The courtroom was packed. The Johnson family, still reeling from their years of torment, sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of relief and anguish. Claire, now visibly stronger but forever marked by the horrors she'd endured, sat beside her husband Richard, who had not left her side since the day they were rescued. The media, of course, were present in droves, their cameras flashing as they captured every moment of the trial. Detective Meghan Hayes stood near the back of the room, her arms folded, watching the proceedings with a quiet intensity. She had done everything in her power to expose the truth, and now she had to watch the criminals, the men and women who had ruined so many lives, face justice. But something gnawed at her. The victory felt bittersweet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. As the prosecution laid out their case, Meghan's mind wandered back to the days leading up to the trial. The pressure had been unbearable: threats on her life, personal attacks, and a constant sense of being watched. She had even lost contact with Marcus, her former informant, who had mysteriously disappeared after providing her with crucial information. She feared he'd paid the ultimate price for his involvement. But the trial went on, with the weight of the evidence against the syndicate mounting. Meghan had worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle, and now the truth was finally coming to light. One by one, the criminals were called to the stand. High-ranking officials, business magnates, and even trusted members of law enforcement, all had been complicit in the web of corruption that had trapped the Johnson family in their secret room for 9 long years. The cost of exposing the truth. The trial was brutal. Every day, Meghan faced a new barrage of threats, anonymous phone calls, strange encounters with shady figures in dark alleys, and the unmistakable sense that the people she had fought to expose were not going to let her off easy. She had already lost so much in her pursuit of justice: friends, her career, and parts of her own innocence. And yet, standing in the courtroom, watching the guilty parties squirm as they were confronted with the truth, she felt a fleeting sense of victory. But it wasn't enough. It never would be. On the final day of the trial, as the prosecution called their final witnesses, Megan received a chilling phone call. It was from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "Detective Hayes," the voice said, its tone cold and calculating. "You've made a dangerous mistake. The game is far from over." Megan's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line went dead before she could get an answer. Her pulse quickened as a new wave of fear swept over her. The feeling that something wasn't quite right, the dread that had been following her since the beginning of this case, was now undeniable. The final betrayal. Later that evening, as the final verdicts were handed down and the convicted criminals were led away in handcuffs, Megan finally allowed herself a moment of respite. The Johnsons had been given justice, and she had done her part in bringing the truth to light. But as she walked out of the courtroom, she noticed something strange: an unfamiliar figure standing in the shadows. She couldn't see his face, but his posture was unmistakable. He was watching her. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Just then, her phone rang again. This time, it was Claire Johnson on the other end. "Megan," Claire's voice trembled. "There's something you need to know. Something we didn't tell you." Megan's blood ran cold. "What is it?" "It's about my father," Claire said, her voice cracking. "He wasn't just involved with the syndicate. He was its leader. We were all trapped because of him. He betrayed us. He betrayed everyone." Megan felt the ground beneath her feet shift. She had suspected something was off, but this revelation shook her to the core. Claire's father, once a respected figure in their community, had masterminded the entire scheme. The kidnapping, the confinement, the silence, it had all been part of his plan to protect the syndicate's secrets. "Are you sure?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Claire confirmed, her words laden with sorrow. "I found documents after you left the house. He was involved in everything. And now, he's gone, Megan. He's dead." The weight of Claire's confession hit Megan like a ton of bricks. She had spent so long fighting for justice, but she hadn't realized the true depth of the betrayal until now. Claire's father had manipulated everyone: his own family, the police, and even the syndicate. Megan's victory had come at a great cost, and now she understood that the truth had a far more sinister face than she could have ever imagined. The price of truth. As the weeks passed, the case against the syndicate unraveled further, and many of the key players were arrested. But despite the justice that had been served, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that her victory had come at too high a price. She had exposed a dark world of corruption, but in doing so, she had lost pieces of herself along the way. Her reputation, once solid, was now tarnished. Some of her colleagues viewed her with suspicion, others with contempt. The department, rocked by scandal, was in disarray, and many of the officers she had worked alongside were now under investigation. Even her personal life had suffered. The relentless pursuit of justice had driven a wedge between her and her loved ones. Friends and family who had once supported her were now distant, unsure of the person she had become. Megan stood at a crossroads. The case was over, the criminals had been brought to justice, but the emotional and psychological toll had been far greater than she could have imagined. The nightmares, the constant fear, and the overwhelming sense of loss haunted her every day. She had given everything for the truth, but now she wondered if it had been worth it. As the last of the criminals were taken away in cuffs, Megan stood alone in the courtroom, the echoes of the trial fading into the background. She had exposed the darkest corners of the human soul, but in doing so, she had lost her own peace of mind. Looking out the courtroom window, Megan made a silent vow: she would continue fighting for justice, but she would never again allow herself to become consumed by it. The truth had set the Johnson family free, but it had left her with scars that would take years to heal. And as she walked out into the fading light of day, she wondered what the future would hold for her, and if she would ever find peace again.